Okay, so I need to get my screen shared here. Can you let me know when you can see that?
Still, yeah, there it is.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. Thank you for joining, everybody, and welcome to this session on the Microsoft Azure API for FHIR. My name is Michael Hansen, and I work on our Health Cloud and Data team. We make, amongst other things, our FHIR server for Azure. We also have a few other things that we're working on. Some of them I'll show here today. This presentation is kind of part of or connected a little bit to another presentation that I'm giving tomorrow. So I wanted to set that up. So in this presentation here, I'll be focusing on our FHIR API and how you can build applications with it, how you can get data into it. And then tomorrow, we're going to take a look at a little bit of the downstream side of that. What are you going to do with this data once you have some data in a FHIR service in Azure? And we're going to focus mostly on Power BI and diving into how you connect with Power BI tomorrow, but I'll also show just general things around exporting data and using Databricks and so on. For all the presentations and slides and examples and things, there's this link here on the slide, which will take you to a GitHub repo that I've set up. In there will be PDFs of my presentations for both today and tomorrow, and also code snippets and Jupyter notebooks and other things that we may be showing in those presentations. So it should all be in there. These slides, by the way, I will not be going through all of the stuff that's in those slides in this presentation, but those slides contain screenshot of everything that I'll be demoing here. So that with enough detail that you should be able to do it yourself. So don't worry about following along necessarily now. I should have screenshot everything for you so that you can do it yourself. So with that, we're going to dive in and focus on the Azure API for FHIR. And for those of you who attended Doug's 7th session this morning, he sort of set this up. But for everybody else, I want to make sure that I just explain properly what projects it is that we have and how they're connected. So we really have two different things around FHIR servers or FHIR services. And one is called the FHIR server for Azure, and that's an open source project that's available on GitHub. You can go and grab that, mess with the code, hack around in it, deploy it yourself and so on. And then we also take that and run it for customers as a managed service where we then provide an SLA and so on. But from the perspective of the FHIR service itself, they're very similar. There will probably be some features that are newer in the open source version because that's where it goes in first, and I'll go into detail with that a little bit. But from a service perspective, they're the same. And you can follow along with that GitHub project, see what it is that we're doing, comment on issues, participate, and even contribute code if you would like. It's something we very much encourage. And we've taken some pull requests from the public too. So we invite you to participate in that project, and then we also run that managed service. So I want to just dive into those a little bit, and I'll also walk through some of the details as we demo here. So the open source FHIR server, to find that, you go to GitHub, and then it's Microsoft/FHIR server. And in there you find, you can see it's a very active project. We have lots of people working in that and participating, commenting, putting up issues and so on. It supports Stu 3, R4, and there's also a draft R5 in there. That's one example of something that is not in the managed service yet, since it's not released yet. But will be, and so you can follow along with the work and play with it and see how that might be, how that might work once it's out. It's very easy, even though it's open source, very easy to deploy. We have templates and so on that will allow you to get up and running with this quickly in your Azure subscription. We have two different backend persistence providers for this. One is based on Cosmos DB and one is based on SQL. But this is again open source code that you take responsibility for, and I'll get back to that. If on the other hand, you just want something, you just want a FHIR API and you just want somebody to run it for you, then we have what's called the Azure API for FHIR, which is our managed service that you can go and provision in the portal. And I'll show you in a second how to do that. And right now that supports Stu 3 and R4. But again, whatever features are currently in the open source will meander its way into the managed service as soon as we feel like it's ready. So there are a few differences, though, in terms of what you take responsibility for when you run these services. I use this slide a lot to explain this, but it's important when you think about running stuff in the cloud, what it is that you take responsibility for. So you could, of course, build your own cloud and take responsibility for everything, and then you have full control of all your hardware and everything that is involved in this in your setup. But if you move to cloud, then there are different stages of it, right? You could put stuff into some virtual machines. Then you're no longer responsible for the hardware, but you're responsible for all the stuff that runs on that hardware. Or you can move into what's called platform as a service, where the underlying layers, including runtimes and middlewares and so on, are provided for and maintained by the cloud provider. And actually, these two different offerings of the FHIR service fit into this platform as a service model. If you run the open source FHIR server for Azure, it means that the application now, the FHIR service, is something that you take responsibility for. You take that code off GitHub, you may modify it, and then you put it into the FHIR service, and then you put it into a managed platform. But you now own the responsibility for updating that, schema changes, migrations, and so on and so forth. If on the other hand, that is not something you want to do, then you could pick the Azure API for FHIR, which is our managed service, and then we take care of those things for you. All you see is a FHIR API, and then we will manage the rest of it for you. So again, different projects may have more preference for one of these options, and it may also be that in your development lifecycle, you may use the open source for one part of it and the managed service for another part of it. And we encourage both things, and you know, encourage you to participate in the open source project, even if you're running the managed service in production. One thing that can determine which one you want to run, though, is also where it's available. So here, the yellow spots here are the regions of Azure where we provisioned the managed Azure API for FHIR. So if it's not available in a region where you would like it in, we would like to know about it. So do reach out and talk to us about that. Or you can optionally run the open source in some of these other locations here. We have others coming online, including Azure Government and a few others that we're working on. But we would like to hear from you if you think it should be somewhere where it's not. Okay, so that's like a little bit of brief introduction of what it is that we're making. And now I want to really flip over and do demoing and just show you how this different stuff works. And we're going to build this up slowly.
Michael, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. This seems to be a question from John Olson. This seems to be a standalone FHIR server. Any plans to make more of a FHIR mapping service onto native APIs?
So FHIR mapping service, was that the question? Yeah. So we don't currently have any FHIR mapping directly in the FHIR service. We are working on various tools to convert data. I'll show that a little bit later. It's not presently based on the FHIR mapping language, but we are looking to build functionality into our service that allows you to take existing data formats, so V2, CCDA, convert them to FHIR and put them into the FHIR service. So I'll get to that towards the end of the demo.
Okay.
So it's sort of a half yes, half no answer, if you will.
Okay, thank you.
So we're going to dive in here, and what we're going to do here is we're going to take this in stages, and we're going to build up an application sort of slowly. And first, we're going to do something very simple. We're just going to have a very simple client web app, a JavaScript app that connects to a FHIR API, and we have an identity provider in there. And because this is in Azure, we're going to use the Azure API for FHIR. We're going to use a web app to host this web application, and then Azure Active Directory is going to be our identity provider. This would be very quick for us to get through this. I just want to show you that it's quick to get up and running and build an application. Then we're going to make this a little bit more elaborate, and I have this Sandbox environment that Doc 7 also showed this morning. It's available on GitHub as well. I've already provisioned this, but this allows you to sort of ingest data and work with it. We have a little dashboard where you can view the patients. We have Smart on FHIR applications. You can export. This export part of it, I will not focus on much in this presentation, but we'll cover tomorrow when we talk about working with the data for analytics. And then for this environment here, we'll then do a little modification of it. And maybe this comes to this question that was just, we're going to hook it up to another project that we have that's in open source too, that's called the FHIR Converter. We're going to use that to convert HL7v2 messages that we put on a service bus, and then we're going to ingest them into the FHIR server and show that they show up. I want to walk through this just as an example of how you can start stitching many different cloud services together to build little environments and sandboxes and production systems. So let's dive into it. And from here on, it's going to be mostly demo unless everything falls apart, and then I have backup slides. But we're going to start with the Azure API for FHIR. So I'm going to go over to my browser here, which you should see. Somebody let me know if they're not seeing my browser. But what we're going to do here now is we're going to work with some different pieces of an environment that I've already provisioned. But I want to show you first what it would look like if I just wanted to get a FHIR API. So I can go here and I can just go and now search for FHIR. Azure API for FHIR shows up in the portal, and I can say create. This will take me through the experience of creating a new FHIR service. I would have to create a resource group to put it in. I'll give it a name, and then I have to pick a region and the version of FHIR, and then you simply hit review and create. I'll not do that here now because I've done it already, but it will take a few minutes, and then you have a FHIR service up and running. So this is kind of the quickest way to get a FHIR service. It's all managed. There's nothing you need to worry about in terms of database and where do things live and how does it all work and so on. We take care of all of that. So it's pretty straightforward and fast to get up and running. And what I've done here is I've actually created a little resource group in here where I have provisioned a few things that we're going to show for this little mini application. So there is the Azure API for FHIR is here. There is an app service, which is where we're going to host the web application that we're going to be working at. I've also provisioned something called a log analytics workspace, which is where we collect audit logs for this FHIR service. So it's one of the things that you get in this managed service. And then there's like an app service plan and a few other things in here that we won't focus on too much here. In these slides, I've captured kind of the steps of how all of this is provisioned. But I want to click in here and just show you a few of the things that I've configured in this FHIR service so that you can be aware of how to do those things. So you click into the FHIR service here, and then you see here's the metadata endpoint. So you could immediately pop that over into Postman, and which we'll do in a second, and interact with the FHIR API. But there are a few other things that I've done here. In here in access control, you can actually control who can access the data in this FHIR service. And if you've worked with our service before, this is actually new. That you can manage access to the data plane in the FHIR service through this, what we call Azure RBAC system. So there are now built-in roles in Azure like FHIR Reader, FHIR Data Reader, FHIR Data Writer, FHIR Data Contributor, FHIR Data Exporter, and so on, that you can assign onto these FHIR services. You can also assign them on a resource group level if you have multiple FHIR services in a resource group. And you can see I've given myself access, and I've also given access to a service client, as it's called here. Which I'll be using in Postman. And what else have I done here? I've configured CORS to allow that to work so that because we're going to be building a web application. And another thing I could point out is that I have connected my logs here, diagnostic settings. I'm sending my diagnostic logs to this log analytics workspace. And if I remember to show it at the end, I'll show you that the logs of what we'll be doing here as we interact with the FHIR API show up there in a way where you can easily query them and so on, generate reports of who's accessing the FHIR API. But let's check that we actually have a working FHIR API, and I'm going to use Postman for that. I have already set up some environment variables here to point to my FHIR server, and I should be able to simply hit the metadata endpoint here, and we can see the FHIR service is working. If I try to access it here, I get a 200 OK, but I don't have any patients in my database. I'm actually using Azure Active Directory here to get a token. So you can see I'm using client credentials. I put in some stuff here to be able to get a token, just to show you that worked. I already had a valid token because I just tested it before we started here. And then, of course, I can start putting data into this FHIR server. So I've queued up a patient here already that I'm going to put into the FHIR server. So I'm just going to hit post here and get a 201 created. And if I go back and look at my list of patients, I can now see that I've created a patient in here. So there's nothing fancy here. There's nothing special. This is just a FHIR service that we manage. Other than that, it works completely as any other FHIR API. So what we're going to do now is we're going to skip over and start working on this little simple web application that's going to be accessing this FHIR API. And what we're using for this is what we call Azure App Services or Azure Web Apps. And that is really just a generic app hosting platform where I can just put in some HTML, I can put in Node.js, I can run a .NET application, whatever is your stack of choice. We're going to do something very simple here. We're just going to have a single HTML file in it with a little bit of JavaScript that will allow us to access this FHIR API. So I'm going to go back over to my Azure portal and go back to the resource group that I have here. And here's this app service that I'll be using. I've cheated a little bit, like you know, in the cooking show, and I've already uploaded the code for this application, but it's in that GitHub repo where the slides are, so you can go and grab it. So what we're going to do here is there's actually a utility here, an app service editor, where you can just in the browser go and edit what's in this app service. This is obviously not how you would write code in a production system, but here it allows us to very easily go in the browser and modify this application. So you can see there's a single index.html file here. And most of it is just a little bit of JavaScript, which is really fairly boilerplate. We're using the Microsoft Access library here to interact with Azure Active Directory and get a token. There's information about what client ID I'm using, what tenant I'm accessing, and then what FHIR endpoint I'm going to try and access here. So all of that is in the code example. You just have to replace with your own details. Then we're going to get a token for this FHIR server, and then we're just going to enumerate all the patients. So this is very simple. All the rest of this stuff is just, you know, callbacks for, I get an authorization code back, and then I have to go get a token, and so on and so forth. We're not going to dive into that in too much detail here. But I'm going to go back here, and you can find the URL for this app up here. So I'm going to paste that into the browser. And what you can see here now is that this thing is asking me to sign in. I'm not going to hit the sign in button. Normally it will pop up and ask me for my username and password, but I'm already signed in because I'm using the same credentials to access the portal. So it will detect the single sign-on, notice who I am, and then it will now list the single patient that we just added to the FHIR service, right? So this is a very simple end-to-end example of how you can quickly spin up a FHIR server in Azure, and then you can create a web application that accesses this. There's an identity management platform, and all this sort of stuff comes with the environment. I promised that I was going. Yep, go ahead.
I have a question. Can this FHIR server also be used as a facade to existing databases?
It cannot in its current form. So the managed FHIR service has a backend persistence layer that we manage, including schema migrations and all this sort of stuff that has to be done. You could, in principle, take our open source code and then use that to create a facade on top of an existing persistence provider. So our persistence provider model has certain methods that you have to implement for search, for read, for writes, and so on. So there's an interface. If you go implement that interface for your specific data layer, then you could use the rest of the stack as a facade, but it will not run as a managed service as that would be your modified code.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah. And great, just if there are other questions, just keep them coming here. So I wanted to show just this log analytics workspace here where we're actually capturing all the logs, and I hope I'll be able to see some logs in here. I'm just going to run a query that I've done in the past. So what you can actually see, so this is a pretty cool environment here where you can use this Custo language to query logs and aggregate them and so on. It's one of the things that you sort of get with being in a managed cloud platform. So I could go in, for instance, and grab, it was a 200 for something that I want to read. I can actually see who accessed this, not with PII, right, but with, this was this identity provider and this specific object ID that accessed the data. So in terms of like maintaining audit logs and seeing who did what on this FHIR API, you have a platform where all that gets aggregated and can be viewed. So I'm going to go back here to my slides just briefly, and now we're going to skip ahead and start taking a look at this slightly larger sandbox that we have. And I would like to, this was kind of a little detour here to show a slide that I didn't actually need to show. I'm just going to go back here and use the browser. I want to show you where you can find this samples environment. So if you go to GitHub /Microsoft/FHIR server, that's where our FHIR server is. You can see lots of activity in here, issues, all the usual stuff. We welcome you to participate in that. But if you just add -samples at the end of this, then there's another repo that we maintain. And this repo is not actually part of the FHIR service, but it shows how it can be used in various different environments, and it's a little bit of a sandbox test environment that's easy to spin up. Comes in a few different flavors. You can spin it up with the managed Azure API for FHIR and the additional application here, or you can actually spin up the open source version of the server, either with SQL backend or Cosmos DB backend, and then use the same components in here. We support a number. Was there a question?
Yeah, there is a question about scopes. So that's part of the Smart on FHIR part. How scopes can be given on the FHIR server?
Yeah, we don't currently support scopes. You either have access or you don't, which is something that we're working on putting the right sort of model together for. But we don't, at the moment, we don't support them and we don't enforce them.
All right. And another question, can the Azure API for FHIR be deployed on-premise or anywhere other than Azure?
So you can take the open source code and deploy it on your laptop or wherever you want. So the Cosmos DB backend for the open source is only available in Azure, but the open source code also supports SQL. So you could deploy it with an on-prem SQL server, for instance. But again, it's open source, so we can't like provide SLA and so on if you run it on-prem, but you can it's all containerized. We build containers out of this, and you can grab the containers out of our registry and deploy those yourself. So you can deploy the open source, but not the managed service on-prem.
Great, thank you. Go ahead.
So this environment, I just wanted to say a couple of other things about it. We actually use this to illustrate a number of different complicated scenarios around authentication, using different identity providers for your Azure subscription and for the data plane of your service. And so to allow all of that to get configured, we use some PowerShell scripts in order to provision this. If you don't use PowerShell and you've never used it and you don't have it on your computer, don't worry about it. You can actually always go to the portal and just hit the Cloud Shell button here, and then you can spin up a Cloud Shell which can either be PowerShell or it can be Bash Shell. So you don't have to have PowerShell installed on your machine to do this. We use a couple of different PowerShell modules here to manage identity and other things that you need to sign into. I won't go into the details of doing this right now, but the environment that I have provisioned is basically provisioned with something like this, where I use the PaaS service for the FHIR server, and I've also enabled export, which I won't use here today, but I'll use it tomorrow. I'll use the same environment tomorrow. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to show kind of what gets provisioned when you actually do this, and then we'll walk through a few of those resources. I'm going to close the Cloud Shell here since we're not going to provision it here. I'll go back to my dashboard, and then these two columns here in the middle is actually what gets provisioned when you provision the environment here. There's a couple of resource groups. One is the basic resource group, and the other one has the Smart on FHIR applications that I'll show in a second. But if you dive in here, there's a few different things. You'll recognize the Azure API for FHIR. There's a dashboard application, which we're going to look at in a second. And then there's a little thing like this, which is an Azure function that actually is set up to listen to a specific storage account. And when data lands in that storage account, it will get ingested. So you can see when I click it itself, it doesn't actually do anything. It waits for stuff to come into to a storage account. And then there's some storage account associated with it. There's an import storage account where if I click into this, and if I was to go in here to containers and stick Cynthia bundles in this here, they would get ingested and put into the FHIR service. And we're going to leverage that in a slightly different way here towards the end to take converted HL7 v2 messages that turn into bundles and put those in that way into the FHIR service. There's also an export storage account where if I call $export, the exported result will come out of this. And again, we'll look at this tomorrow. But I'm going to just show you the dashboard environment here, which I have also loaded up in advance. So this is a very simple JavaScript application that is in there in the source code repo. You're welcome to hack it. This is just meant so that you could quickly look at some FHIR data. So for instance, I can look into this particular patient here, see what's going on in terms of conditions and counters and so on. There's nothing fancy here. But what we've also done is we've hooked it up so that you can use a couple of Smart on FHIR applications. So I can bring up the infamous growth chart here. This is actually, we just take it from the Smart on FHIR open source repo. We package it into a container and then we deploy it as part of this environment. But the code is not modified. We've also put in the medications app, not because it's very visually appealing or anything, but because it's a much simpler app. So if you wanted to start playing with this, this would be maybe a simpler app to walk through. So these things are again just shown as an examples of things that you can do. There's also a little pane here where you can actually get a token for this FHIR service, and you can get the URL for the FHIR service. So of course, this is not something you would do in production, but it allows you to play with this environment and sort of do some debugging and so on. I've also configured an environment here in Postman for this. So if I go over to my Sandbox environment here, and if I try to get patients now, I should get unauthorized because I don't have a token yet, but I will get a token and update that, and then we can see that these are the patients that are in that. So I preloaded a few hundred patients in this environment to get started. So you can go and play with that sandbox, deploy it, take it apart. It's actually made up of a number of smaller templates that you can deploy individually. So for instance, the importer, it can be deployed individually. The dashboard and the other applications can be deployed individually. But we do have this sort of end-to-end deployment for it that you can use. Okay, so what I'm going to do next now, though, is I'm going to take this up a notch slightly. We're going to try and put some HL7 v2 data into this environment, and we're going to put this in using another open source project that we have, which is called the FHIR Converter. And I'm going to pull this up here. FHIR Converter, that is also a GitHub project, and you may have seen Doug 7 demo this in the session that he had a little bit earlier on, but I've spun this up, and we're going to use this to convert some FHIR data, and hopefully all will go well. If not, I did capture screenshots of what I did as I strung this environment together. So this is just a kind of a very simple demo that we're going to be doing here. This project supports conversion of HL7 v2 and CCDA documents. I think Doug showed both of those modes. We're going to focus on HL7 v2 here. It's easy to deploy. You can just hit deploy to Azure here, and what it will do is it will spin up a web app for you and deploy this environment into this web app. And I've done that also in advance in my little cooking show here. So I have a number of different things that I've provisioned here, but one of the things is this converter here. And if I go and grab the URL for this converter, I should be able to put it in here and bring up the conversion tool. And so what we're actually looking at here now in this open source project, when you provision this, what you actually get sent to is kind of a simple user interface that we've created for editing templates for this converter. So this converter is based on handlebars templates. I'll show it in a second with some additional features added to them. But these are templates that you can edit so that whatever conventions that you use regarding HL7 v2 at your institution, you can adjust those so that they go into the templates. And then you can save these templates, and now you have an API where you can call convert over and over again with a specific template of your choice. So we provide a set of starting templates. These starting templates are hopefully not our opinion. They're based on the work that was going on in the HL7 V2 to FHIR track, where you know, lots of people contributed to a number of spreadsheets. We take those spreadsheets and then we convert them into these templates with a little bit of code that we've written to do that. But I'm going to demo this and just show you how this works. So I'm going to pull up an ADT message here. So the way this UI works is you kind of have to look at the input message on top, and then the flow goes from left to right here. I'm going to load up a template to convert with. And what you will see is, so this is basically, you see the sort of outlined skeleton of a FHIR bundle here of type transaction. But then you can see inside this bundle here that we call multiple downstream templates. So for instance, here I can click into this patient template and see how we actually convert a specific patient. And then you see the output over here, the bundle that ends up getting generated from this specific ADT message here in this case. And this is all interactive. So if I just close this for a second here, actually, no, let me show you here. If I edit the template here, so I could actually make this invalid in terms of FHIR. I could call this resource patient XXX, and you can now see that this shows up in the output over here. So you can sit and live edit these templates and get the conversion that you would like. This goes round trip to the API, so it's not like super swift, but you get immediate feedback and you can see the output of the conversion that you're doing. We also take this particular test message into consideration, and then we make adjustments based on that. So for instance here, the patient ID you can see is sitting up here in this PID field up here. And if I edit the ID here, you can see that this immediately gets reflected in the output message here. So you can see how that works. But there are a number of other interesting things here to note. One is that what also changed was the ID of the FHIR resource here. So this particular ID here actually changed. And that's because we have functions, helper functions, that will generate deterministic IDs based on specific input information. So here we're generating an ID with the input seed being this this ID that's up here. So if I modify this ID, set it back to what it was, I will get back to the original ID. So this is important because if you have these messages coming in over and over again, and you want to make sure that you keep updating the same resources, you want to be able to create IDs that are consistent. So once we've done all of that and we've edited our template, then we actually have an API available that we can go in and use to convert with a specific template name here. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to take a little logic app. So I've configured a few more resources in here that that will take this data and send it to a logic app and convert it. And then this Azure function here that we had for ingest will then take this data and ingest it into the FHIR API if all goes well. So I'm going to go into a service bus that I've hooked up here. I'm going to grab this message here. And I am going to go into a service bus that I've hooked up here, and I've set up a queue. And this is, of course, not how you would normally add data here, but this just allows us to play with it. So I'm going to put in this message, and I'm going to send it to the queue. And so what happens now is there's a logic app, which is a little bit of an integration engine, orchestration engine, if you will. This logic app is listening to the service bus, and when a message comes in, it'll pick it up, and then it will send it to the FHIR API. And actually, instead of me explaining this in words, let me go and look at this logic app here. So what you can see is that this conversion actually just ran now, and it was successful. I can go and see what actually happened in here. You know, when a message is received in a queue, then I'll do an HTTP call. You can see I called it with this message. I sent it to, and then out came this this particular message. and then it will get dumped to blob storage where it will get picked up. So if I now go back over to my Postman here, of course, to make this really great, I should have, of course, checked in advance or shown you in advance that this Donald Duck fellow was not in the FHIR server. But maybe I can make up for that by, for instance, changing his address. But you can see that this patient that came out of the V2 message is now here. So let me just make up for my poor demoing skills here by going and taking this message again. And we're now going to make an adjustment here by, we go to our service bus, and I am going to change something. So for instance, let's say we change the address of the patient here. So I'm going to paste this in, and plain, no, not XML, plain text. And I'm going to find the PID segment here, and let's just say he was not actually living at 111 Doug Street, but 999 instead. And we will send this, and then once again, it'll get picked up by our service bus. But because we use this method of generating IDs that are consistent, this will now generate a new patient resource that has the same ID, but with a different address. And when we go and upsert that into the FHIR server, this will turn into an update, and we will get a new version of this, hopefully. So let's go check our conversion app here. We can see that it ran again, right? And if I go here, we will see, should be able to find the address here. You can see the address has now been changed. And then hopefully, if I go over to the FHIR API, I will find that reflected over here. So here we now see the address has changed, and I should now have, this is version 2 of this particular FHIR resource. So
Michael, there's a question.
Yep.
How does the converter deal with the segment that it cannot parse?
A segment that it cannot parse. So
It's unspecified by the template.
Yeah, so that if it's unspecified by the template, we just don't put it in. So actually, there are some tools here that I sort of skipped over. We take the entire V2 message and we put it into a model that you can access different fields of. But if you don't reference those particular parts of the message, they just don't ever end up over here in the output. We put some little stuff in. You may have noticed here that there's a bunch of red squiggly lines here in this message up here. And what that actually means is that this field is never used. So anything with a red line under is never used in the output. So this is sort of an editing tool when you're sitting here and you're playing with it and you go like, oh, I need to make sure that I get all the information over to the other side. If you have stuff in there with squiggly lines on it, that information is never captured, is never mapped onto the FHIR bundle. And so, of course, it may depend on what template you're actually using, whether or not it gets mapped over there. So
and how do we get to the Git repo that this created to see our templates?
So there is a Git repo internally in this FHIR converter, so that you can actually, so when I save this, they actually get committed internally to a Git repo, and there's a URL for that, so you can clone that locally. You can edit these templates locally and then push them back into the Git repo that runs in there, and so you have a different version of your. That's a different editing experience from this like online editing experience. And we're working on an extension for Visual Studio Code that will allow you to have this experience basically on your laptop. And then you just push and pull with Git to the conversion API. So, but we have a little mini Git repo built into this. So I have 1 minute left. So I just want to pull up my summary slide here and just basically say we're kind of focused here on building sandboxes and quickly putting things together. This is something that you can do quickly yourself with managed services. You don't have to spin up virtual machines and do a whole bunch of heavy lifting. You can easily get from the simple to something that's more elaborate. And I've captured hopefully most of what I did here today in the slides. We did not cover export and analysis of this data, but I'll be focusing on that in my presentation tomorrow. And with that, I just wanted to put up the link for the Git repo. If you need an Azure account, here's my email address. And then thank you for your attention. Hand it back to you, Dave.
Thank you,
Do you have
Michael.
still
Now,
time for question or not?
yes,
Yeah.
yep.
Yeah. Well, it's a question by Victor. So far, you've talked about the development mode. When we go to production, there are some checklists we should be following, or what kind of additional security docs Microsoft has for production and deployment.
Yeah. So for our so it depends a little bit on what you're doing, right? Whether or not you're deploying open source code, whether it's our open source code or it's your own code or your modified code, right? So your checklist will vary a lot depending on how managed these components that you're provisioning are. So for instance, for the FHIR API, we have HIPAA, high trust, and a number of certifications that you can rely on, so that you can say that the service that I'm using, I can check some of those things off my checklist. But we provide guidance in general on how you're supposed to go about doing this, sort of in the context of your specific use case. So if you want to kind of walk through your use case, figure out what you're supposed to be doing, we have some people on our team that can help you out and just take a look at it. There's not like a single answer or a single checklist. It depends a lot on what type of code you're running. Is it something you wrote, or is it something that's a managed service? And if it's a managed service, who's responsible for it, and so on. So there's often a number of components involved, and it would depend on which ones you use.
All right. And is there any support for the FHIR mapping language in the converter that you showed?
No, there is not at the moment.
At the moment.
So we've not. I mean, we really considered this. But we found FHIR mapping language to be not as easily accessible as these sort of templates. But it also has a lot of great features, the FHIR mapping language, just in terms of being better at checking the types and being aware of what's supposed to be in the different structures and so on. So I don't think we've completely made up our minds yet, but we started with this sort of simple template approach, which seemed to be somewhere in between FHIR mapping language and the Google spreadsheets of how to map V2 to FHIR that comes out, which by the way contain like a wealth of just knowledge, years and years of knowledge get captured in these spreadsheets, but they're hard to run something in production based on.
Okay. Well, we're almost we're out of time already, through 3 minutes. Thank you very much. I also thank Doug, your colleague, also answered some questions on the session Q&A. Thank you for that, and thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Marco. Have a great day.
Thank you.